A violent psychopath is playing a twisted mind game with me and I want him to stop. If I had known that placing an innocuous free ad on an internet website would earn me a stalker, and a psychopathic one at that, I would never have done it. But being a struggling freelance graphic designer without a steady line of work and limited financial resources, I took advantage of the opportunity and went ahead and posted it. It was just a 2-line thing that included my trading name and email address, published on one of the major trade sites. It didn't give me the extra work I had been hoping for, but it did give me something else. An unbelievable amount of unsolicited emails from people in the same boat as myself, struggling graphic designers desperately chasing work. And in the following months, I received close to 2,000 emails from people looking for employment. Initially, I responded to all of them and made it clear that I wasn't hiring at the current stage, nor that I was in a position to outsource any projects. But once the number of emails started hitting the triple digits, I stopped. After all, it wasn't like I had placed a job ad. Besides, it was just too time-consuming, and I had other things to do. But still the emails kept pouring in, between 10 to 15 each day. And because they were sent to my official company account, I had to open them. I only gave them a quick perusal, just enough time to establish what it was about, before deftly transferring them over to my electronic trash can. There was, however, one email that stood out, and which I did respond to. It was a long, 700 or 800 word piece written by a guy in a neighboring state. The email described the problems the guy was having securing jobs, and how increasingly difficult it was to keep his daughter in college. He had even attached a picture of himself, and I remember thinking that he had a friendly face, the kind you'd expect to find on a nice older uncle or grandfather. The guy was looking straight at the camera with big, blue cozy eyes and a warm, kind smile on his lips. By all appearances, he was Mr. Friendly himself. And because I wasn't the type of person who was comfortable letting people down, I knew I had to respond to it. It was almost like getting a letter from an old friend or classmate. So, I sat back in my chair and started tapping on the keyboard. I didn't spend too much time on it, only a couple of minutes, enough to let the guy know that I sympathized with his situation. But that, unfortunately, I didn't have any work to offer him. I did it in the nicest way possible and ended the email by wishing the guy all the best in the future. Then I clicked send and forgot all about it and started working on a project for a car hire company that had approached me a few weeks prior. A few hours later, just as I was about to run down to the local cafe to grab something to eat, I received a reply from the old guy. In it, he thanked me for his email and told me that he totally understood and thanked me for his time. I read it, closed it, and thought that was the last time that I would hear from the guy. But that didn't turn out to be the case. The next morning when I opened my Facebook app, I saw that the guy had subscribed to my company page. I thought it was a bit strange but didn't think too much of it. The guy was probably just doing some networking. Hell, I was definitely guilty of that myself. In this economy, you had to do whatever you could to try to land a gig. So I pushed it to the back of my mind. But after a couple of days, when the guy began commenting on my posts, it got a little bit weird. At first, it was just a few innocuous lines here and there, congratulating me on the various projects I had completed and posted samples of to my Facebook page. I didn't particularly mind, but when the messages just kept coming, not to mention increased in frequency, I started to worry. There was something unsettling about the comments. It was like the guy wanted me to respond to him and thank him for his feedback. And I got the distinct impression that if the feedback wasn't to the guy's liking, he was apt to fly off the handle. The messages oozed passive aggressiveness. This continued for about a week. And in the end, I realized that I had to put my foot down, so I sent the guy a private message, politely asking him to stop commenting on my Facebook page. I wrote the message late in the evening, and after sending it, I hoped it would be the end of that. But unfortunately, it was the start of something much more sinister. And when I did my usual social media round the following morning, I got the shock of a lifetime. I was sitting at the kitchen table, slightly bent forward, a coffee mug in my left hand and my smartphone in the other. I had just opened my Facebook notification page and discovered that more than 40 new comments had appeared overnight. And as far as I could tell, they all seemed to come from the same guy. I clicked on the first one and felt my gut turn to ice. The guy had left a 3-paragraph comment, laden with profanities and the vilest language that I had ever seen. I was absolutely stunned, and I raised my head up from the screen and looked out the window for a couple of seconds. Then I shook my head, as if I had just imagined it, before returning my attention to the phone again. But unfortunately, I hadn't. The horrible comments were still there. I quickly clicked through the notifications and discovered that the guy had left comments on every single post for that month. And they were just as disgusting as the first one. And in addition to the despicable abuse directed at me personally, the guy had copied and pasted a highly defamatory statement and attached it to the end of each vile rant. It read, "George Stevens is a fucking asshole and liar. He's been stealing my work and harassing me and my family for months now. George, I hope you die, you fucking piece of shit." I was so thoroughly taken aback that I accidentally knocked the red coffee mug that I had placed in front of me on the table, and hot coffee spilled out in all directions. Some of it ended up in my lap, and I jumped out of my chair and swore loudly. Then, after I had finished dancing around, I slumped back down in the chair again and just sat there staring at the screen. My mind was operating in shell shock mode, and there was only one thought bouncing around in my brain. And that was, what the fuck would my clients and friends think when they saw this? Would I lose some of the contracts that I had been working so hard to secure because of this? I was close to panicking, and I took quite a few deep breaths to try to calm myself. Then my survival instincts kicked in and I did what I should have done straight away. Namely, block the guy from accessing my Facebook page. After that was taken care of, I started going through the offensive posts and deleting the comments. It took me a good 5 minutes to go through it all. And once that was sorted out, I started to feel a little bit more at ease. It was still early in the morning, and with a little bit of luck, no one else would have seen it. I seriously contemplated sending the guy an email, telling him exactly what I thought of his behavior, but decided against it. The guy had obviously mental issues, and I didn't want to aggravate the situation any further. The last thing I needed in my life right now was a cyberspace psycho stalking me on my social media sites. Once was more than enough, and it did appear to be the correct choice of strategy, because for the next few days I didn't hear anything from the old weirdo. And as the week drew to a close, I was convinced that that was the end of it. But that all changed 2 weeks later when I was walking out of my local Woolworth store. It was early evening, and I had spent 12 hours straight in front of the computer, working on a very demanding rebranding project. I was tired, and I was pushing the trolley without paying too much attention to my surroundings. I was heading toward the pedestrian crossing that would take me to the parking lot on the other side. A few moments before I arrived, I noticed a black Volvo approaching. I didn't pay much attention to it and continued walking toward the crossing, assuming that the car would stop. And a few seconds later, I began making my way across the 2-lane road that separated the parking lot from the supermarket. But the car wasn't slowing down. As a matter of fact, it accelerated. The sudden roar of the engine got my attention, and I threw my head around and stared at it. It was less than 15 yards away now, and coming straight at me, fast. And with a growing sense of horror, I realized that it wasn't going to stop. I felt the adrenaline rush into my system and my muscles tense. I was a third of the way across the road, and I wasn't going to make it over to the other side in time. I yanked the trolley violently and started running back toward the curb. But the car kept bearing down on me, and I was convinced that it would hit me. I would break every bone in my body and spend the next month in hospital. I increased my speed and threw myself toward the sidewalk and managed to get out of the way just as the car roared past. I threw my head around and was about to hurl some well-deserved profanities at the driver when I locked eyes with him. I froze and felt an ice-cold shiver run down my spine. I recognized the face instantly. In fact, I had been looking into that very same face a few weeks earlier, when I had been going through my unsolicited emails. It was the guy that had left the hateful comments on my Facebook page. There was no mistaking it. The guy was leaning out of the driver's side window and staring straight at me with hatred in his eyes. His left arm was extended, and I could see that he was flipping me the bird. I stared at him open-mouthed as the car disappeared down the road and continued toward the traffic lights and the main road beyond it. "Hey, are you okay, mister?" A young mother with a child strapped in the seat of a shopping trolley looked at me with deep concern on her face. I nodded to indicate that I was, and the young mother turned her attention to the departing Volvo. Then she looked back at me and shook her head. "That guy almost ran you over," she said. "You were lucky that he didn't hit you." "Yes, I guess I was," I responded feebly and without much conviction. "That could have been us," the young woman said as she squeezed her little girl's hand tightly. I looked at them briefly and thought that her suspicions were unfounded. The guy was after me, not them. But I didn't say it. Instead, I turned my head and kept looking towards the traffic lights in the distance. The young mother remained where she was for a few more seconds, half expecting me to say something else. But when I didn't, she quickly moved along. In the end, no one had been hurt, and it wasn't like she didn't have other things to do. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually I started moving again. My entire body was shaking, and I was covered in sweat. I kept glancing around nervously, making sure that the nutter wasn't coming back again for a second try. When I got to my car, I quickly placed the groceries in the trunk and got inside and sat there for a long time, thinking about what the hell had just happened. I had been too stunned to look at the license plate, so there was no way I could report the incident to the police. Likewise, in my haste to get rid of the vile comments from my Facebook page, I had deleted the only evidence linking the two of us. If I decided to report it to the police, they wouldn't be able to do anything. I had no proof of any wrongdoing. It would be my word against his. In the end, I reluctantly decided not to do anything. But that would change if the guy tried to do something else. And I hoped with all my heart that he wouldn't. I leaned forward and turned the car key in the ignition and made my way out of the parking lot. I took the long way home, constantly looking in the rearview mirror to make sure I wasn't being followed. And when I arrived at my house 20 minutes later, I felt slightly more at ease. I hadn't seen the black Volvo again, and I was sure that no one else had been tailing me. But I was still apprehensive, and I gave the area a quick 360-degree sweep before I closed the car door behind me. Then I wiped the sweat from my forehead and got the 4 grocery bags out of the trunk, before hurrying over to the back of the house. When I arrived at the screen door, I set the bags down, put my hand in my pocket and grabbed the house key and inserted it in the lock. And just as I did so, I heard a sound behind me. It was the sound of something moving very rapidly, and I was only able to turn halfway around before something crashed into my head and everything went dark. When I came to, I noticed that I was lying on something cold and hard. The second thing I noticed was that I had a terrible headache. The side of my head felt like it had been run over by a semi-truck. I let out a low grunt and slowly got up on my knees. Then I started shaking my head like a boxer who has just recovered from a severe blow to the skull. After a few seconds of utter confusion, the thoughts of what had happened to me earlier that day started to come back, and I began wondering where the hell I was. When I got back up on my feet, I realized that I was inside some type of cylindrical structure. I looked around and saw that it was a concrete storage tank. It was dark in there, and the only light I could see came from a faint source somewhere beyond the top of the structure. The tank had to be at least 10 foot or so from top to bottom, and I was wondering how the hell I'd ended up there. Then I noticed the handcuff around my right hand and my heart skipped a beat. I looked down at it dumbfounded and shook my head a few more times. Then I closed my eyes briefly before opening them again. But my mind wasn't playing any tricks on me. I was handcuffed. I let my eyes wander over to my side and saw that the other end of the handcuff was attached to a chain fixed to a metal plate secured firmly to the tank's concrete base. Then my mind finally kicked into gear, and I remembered seeing the psycho that had left all the hateful comments on my Facebook page outside the Woolworth store. I felt the blood rush out of my head and accumulate somewhere in my lower body. The fucking nutcase must have assaulted me, drugged me and placed me at the bottom of a goddamn well. I yanked at the chain, but the only thing I achieved was to inflict a sharp pain in my wrist. I let my right hand slide down to my side, and instead raised my left hand up to my head and winced when I felt a big lump just behind my ear. Holy crap, the guy must have whacked me really good. Then another thought entered my mind: the cell phone. All I had to do was dial 911 and the police would come and get me. I thrust my hand into my pocket and received yet another shock. The phone wasn't there. I checked the other pockets, but it wasn't there either. Then I threw myself down and began checking the floor, thinking it must have fallen out when I was lying down. But it was nowhere to be found. The son of a bitch had taken it. I jumped back up again and began kicking the wall. Then I looked up and started shouting, "Hey, get me out of here, you fucking psycho. I know who you are." I waited a few seconds, but there was no reply. "Hey, can you hear me, you sick fuck? Get me the hell out of here or you'll be really fucking sorry." The threat sounded hollow, but it was the only thing I could think of there and then. A few seconds passed, and then I heard something. It was a low gushing sound. Then moments later I saw water start washing over the edge and run down the side of the wall. And that's when the panic set in. I was chained to the bottom of a tank, and someone had just opened a tap. A tap that had the capacity to fill the tank all the way to the top with water. And the handcuff and chain would see to it that I remained at the bottom, unable to escape. I was trapped, and I was about to die. I started hyperventilating and began screaming from the top of my lungs, at the same time as I started yanking at the chain attached to the floor. But it wasn't going anywhere. It was a thick steel chain, and the metal plate it was attached to was secured with heavy-duty expansion bolts. It didn't take long for the first tears to appear, and I could feel them streaming down my cheeks. My vision became blurry, and my chest started to hurt. I lifted my head again and gazed up at the opening and began to plead. "Please, please, let me out of here. I promise I'll do whatever you want. Just please get me the fuck out of here." But no one answered, so I started swearing again. I used the most profane language I could think of and cursed the fucking psycho and his retarded family. But still there was no reaction. Only silence coming from beyond the tank. By now the water had started to accumulate at the bottom, and it had risen to my shoelaces. The water was ice cold, but the temperature didn't bother me. I was too shell-shocked to notice its frigid sting. Then I heard someone moving around somewhere on the top, and moments later something was thrown down to me. It made a light splashing sound as it hit the water, and I turned my attention away from the opening and looked down at the object that was now resting a few inches away from my feet. It appeared to be a knife, tucked inside a sheath. Then a deep voice called down to me, and what it said sent an ice-cold shiver down my spine. "Hey, a swipe, how far are you willing to go to save your own life? Are you willing to do what it takes?" I jerked my head back up again, but I was unable to see anyone there. Then the silence returned. The psycho had said his piece and left me to contemplate my options. I lowered my head and stared at the knife with terror-stricken eyes. I even moved a few steps away from it, as if it was a deadly viper ready to strike. Then oh so slowly my eyes were drawn toward the right hand inside the handcuff. I had been given a choice. A horrible choice. Cut my hand off and live or leave it where it was and die an agonizing death. I lost it completely and started hammering my fists against the concrete sides and cursing the sick psycho that had put me in this horrible situation. And as I did so the water kept rising. By now it was halfway up my calves. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on my breathing, but it didn't seem to have any effect. I slapped my face a few times and told myself to get my shit together. Then I looked down again at the area where the knife had landed. The water had obscured it, and I had to feel around with my hands for a few seconds before I was able to locate it. When I found it, I snatched it and stood back up again. Then I slowly pulled it out of its sheath with trembling hands. It was an almost exact replica of the knife Sylvester Stallone had popularized in the film First Blood. It had a serrated edge on the top for sawing, and a razor-sharp edge for cutting on the other. I looked at it for a long time, before closing my eyes again. Jesus fucking Christ. There was no way in hell I would be able to cut off my own hand. I looked down at my wrist again and felt the water tickling my knees. Another 20 minutes and I would be dead unless I took some drastic measures to prevent it. Fuck. I swallowed hard and felt the sweat running down my forehead and into my eyes. I quickly wiped it away with the sleeve of my jacket. Then I put the knife against my wrist, took a few deep breaths, closed my eyes again, and did absolutely nothing. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't cut off my own hand. There was something hardwired into my brain that prevented me from amputating anything attached to my body. I let out a deep primal scream and started banging on the concrete wall again. Then more tears started streaming down my cheeks. Was this how I was going to die? Chained to the bottom of a well like a sick animal. This wasn't the way things were supposed to play out. I was only 27 years old. There were so many things that I hadn't done yet. By now the water was almost touching my hips, and the temperature was starting to affect me. I was shaking, and for a few moments I feared I was going to lose the grip on the knife. I took a few more deep breaths, steeled myself and placed the knife against my wrist for the second time. Then I closed my eyes again, willing myself to cut it off, telling myself it was the only way out. But still, I couldn't. I just couldn't go ahead with it. I cried some more tears and felt defeat wash over me like a raging torrent. I was going to die in less than 10 minutes, and I was just going to stand there and wait for it to happen. What a fucking loser I was. And all the while, the water continued to rise. First up to my stomach, and then up to my chest. And now I was really starting to panic. I yanked at the chain like a madman, but the metal plate at the bottom of the tank held strong. It would never relinquish its grip. When the water reached my chin, I stood up on my toes. And when it reached my mouth, I began treading the water. There were a couple of inches of slack left in the chain, but soon I wouldn't be able to keep my head above water, and that would be the end of George Stevens. The water continued to rise, and soon there was no more slack left in the chain. I tilted my head back in a desperate attempt to avoid the inevitable. I was treading the water like crazy and could feel it touch my lower lip. And I knew I had to do it. I had to cut off my hand. I filled my lungs with as much air as I could manage to inhale, held my breath, and ducked below the dark surface. The only way out now was to discard the hand. I stared at it through the dark water and saw the other hand holding the knife move the sharp instrument toward it. Then I felt an unbearable pain in my right wrist and saw blood starting to seep out just above the handcuff and slowly fan out around it like weightless red dye. The pain was excruciating, but still the hand controlling the knife kept going. It cut and sliced through the tendons, veins, and ligaments connecting it to the rest of the arm. I feared I was going to pass out, but I managed to keep going. By now my lungs were ready to burst, and I knew I wouldn't be able to stay under the water for very much longer. I moved the knife back and forth a few more times. Then I yanked my right arm hard against the handcuff. But the arm was still connected to the hand. I yanked it one more time, then a second time, and then on the third attempt it finally came loose. My lungs were screaming for air, and I kicked desperately with my legs and broke through the surface as I exhaled the spent oxygen. I took a deep breath and then lifted my right arm up to my face and saw the bloody stump where my hand had been less than a minute before. Then I screamed like I'd never screamed before, the sound waves echoing between the concrete walls and hurting my ears. At some point after that, probably no more than half a minute or so, my brain kicked into autopilot mode and I began removing my jacket and t-shirt. It was difficult, especially now that I only had one hand, but with some effort, I managed to place a makeshift tourniquet around my lower arm and wrap my t-shirt over the exposed stump. A minute later, I pulled myself out of the tank, and as I did so, I noticed the spotlight that had lit up the area go out. But I paid no attention to it. I was too focused on crossing the clearing in the forest and disappearing into the tree line. I got up on my feet and ran as fast as I could, never looking back once. I just kept running. The only thing on my mind was getting as far away as possible and getting out of this nightmare alive. It was pitch black and impossible to see more than a few feet in front of me, but I could sense the trees getting closer and closer. Then I felt the hard branches scrape against my body, and my feet finding slightly firmer footing. But I didn't slow down, and I kept running until I had no more strength left in my body. Then I fell to the ground, completely spent, and closed my eyes. I just needed a little break, just a little rest before I got back up again. The next time I opened my eyes, I was lying in a hospital bed. I sat up and looked around the room, fearing that I was still trapped. But when the door swung open a few moments later, and a nurse and a doctor entered the room, I started to relax. There were bandages wrapped around my wrist and a sinister-looking cannula inserted into a vein just below my elbow. I immediately started bombarding them with questions, but they were evasive, and instead of answering me, focused on assessing my wounded lower arm. The doctor kept telling me to relax, and eventually told the nurse to give me a sedative, which she did. Then a few moments later, I drifted off to sleep again. The next day, a beefy police officer pulled up a chair next to my bed, sat down and began filling me in on the details. And what he told me was almost as unsettling as ending up in the bottom of the tank. A police patrol had found me passed out on the shoulder of the road just outside the city limits. Upon further inspection, and after having established that my injuries were slightly more serious than your average flesh wound, they had called an ambulance, which had then transported me to the nearest hospital. You were in a semi-conscious state, the police officer told me. You were rambling on about a clearing in the forest in a tank, and how you had been forced to cut off your own hand. The paramedics listened to you, and when they arrived at the hospital, they relayed the information to the police officers on site. They then proceeded to search your clothes to see if they could find any ID, which they didn't. They did, however, find a few rocks of crystal meth, which prompted the doctor to take some blood samples. The beefy officer gave me a bland look, and as they had suspected, you tested positive for the drug. The officer cleared his throat. Thus, based on the available evidence, we reached the conclusion that you cut off your own hand in a drug-fueled rage. I felt my jaw drop. I know this must be painful for you to hear, the police officer continued, but nevertheless that is what we believe took place. Then he shifted his position in the chair and added, You'd be surprised if you knew about all the things that meth addicts get up to when they are under the influence. I've seen people jump out of windows from high-rise apartments and throw themselves out of moving cars. I've also seen addicts stabbing themselves. It's an awful drug, and you shouldn't be messing around with it, son. But I have never used any type of drugs. I haven't even tried pot. I looked helplessly at the officer. I was one of those straight kids that always said no. But it didn't do any good. I could see that he didn't believe me. Instead, he went on about how they had searched for the clearing in the forest, and how they had been unable to locate it. And in the end, they had concluded that I had imagined the whole thing. But I knew what had happened, and it was most definitely not a figment of my imagination. It had been all too real. I had been placed in the bottom of that tank, and I had been forced to do something no human being should ever be forced to do. But I couldn't prove it. And to add to my woes, a prohibited drug had been injected into my system to discredit me and to make sure the cops treated me as a questionable witness. The Facebook psycho had planned it well. I had to give him that. A few minutes later, the guy stood up, gave me a quick nod, and left the room. And that was the end of the matter as far as the police were concerned. The nutter had gotten away with it. A few months passed, and I had to make quite a few adjustments. Because of my newly acquired handicap, I was no longer able to work as a graphic designer. Without my right hand, it was simply not possible. It was probably why the guy had chosen to cuff the right hand instead of the left. I had tried to figure out why the guy had become so upset when I had asked him to stop commenting on my Facebook page, and why he had chosen me. But I was unable to come up with a meaningful answer, because such an answer simply didn't exist. I was also wondering if I was the guy's first and only victim. I guessed I would never find out. And in the end, I was just glad that I had survived. All these thoughts were running through my mind one Thursday afternoon as I was going outside to check the mail. The thoughts were distracting me, and that's probably why I didn't see the black Volvo until it was less than 20 yards away. It slowed down next to me, and I could see the window on the driver's side being lowered. I felt a jolt run through my body, and I stopped dead in my tracks. My eyes were locked onto the person driving the car. He was in his early 60s, and he had a fake bandage soaked in red dye wrapped around the lower section of his right arm. And as he passed my house, he leaned out the window and looked over at me. "Hey, how's the hand to swipe? You better be more respectful in the future. If you don't, you might just lose the other one too." It was the Facebook stalker. The guy that had chained me to the bottom of the tank. The guy that had made me cut off my own hand. I stood there completely petrified between the mailbox and the entrance door, watching the car make its way toward the end of the street. And as it cleared the corner and disappeared out of view, I felt an icy lump form in my stomach. Then the shaking started. The guy is not done yet, I thought. He won't stop until I've drawn my last breath. Then I collapsed to the ground and felt the darkness wrap itself around me and hoped with all my heart that when I woke up, it would turn out that it was all just a bad dream.